Okay, let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Jody, and I'm a data security consultant here at Very Good Security. And I want to take you through the PCI and Compliance in 7 Days webinar. First, we'll start with a little agenda, an introduction by me, which we just covered. We're going to do a few housekeeping items. Next, we'll cover PCI Compliance, what it is. Then we'll jump into a few different options for PCI solutions. Next, we'll go into the benefits of a solution like VGS or Very Good Security. After that, we'll dive into a quick, brief demo, and then we'll leave some time at the end for a Q&A. So, on to the housekeeping items. All participants are in listen-only mode and are muted. The session is currently being recorded. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. And the way that you can interact with GoToWebinar and submit those questions is via the small icon on the right-hand side with the question mark in the little thought bubble. We'll make sure we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end and try to leave 5 to 8 minutes for Q&A. If there's any additional questions or you want to talk through your specific use case or you have specific PCI related questions, happy to field those. Contact us at any time at sales@verygoodsecurity.com. On to PCI. So PCI compliance, what is it, the 12 requirements, and then how does this actually impact you? Next, we'll go into who needs to be compliant and the differences between the different PCI levels, auditing, QSAs, also giving you some ideas of what PCI level you might fall into. And then the compliance process, what's required, and then, how do you verify and show others and partnerships that you are compliant. What is PCI compliance? It's the payment card industry data security standard, as opposed to regulations that we've seen recently, such as CCPA in California or GDPR in Europe around data privacy. This is actually a regulation that's set in place by the major card brands. So Visa, MasterCard, Discover, JCB, all set apart in a nonprofit organization to set up the PCI DSS standards, because as a whole, the industry benefits if people, especially merchants, issuers, anyone in the line of payments, adopts these standards and prevents data leaks and also any type of security breaches that could happen. Who needs to be PCI compliant? Really anyone that touches any type of major card brand. So if you touch American Express, Discover, MasterCard, Visa, in a basic sense, if you accept card data, if even if it's briefly, even if you're passing it on to a third party as a merchant or a service provider, PCI compliance will apply to you. This is both for credit cards and debit cards. PCI compliance is broken down into 12 different sections, and within it, there are over 200 kind of smaller requirements that need to be met. But for the most part, you can break them down into 12 subject categories. This is where, typically when people start offering a service that touches payment card data, or they start maybe accepting card not present transactions, this is where they kind of get into it and understand the full breadth and scope of what it really requires to comply with these standards. And keep in mind that when Visa, MasterCard, and Discover, set about making PCI DSS standards, the primary thought was, there's going to be a lot of larger companies that are holding millions of cards, and we're going to need to make sure they have all these controls in place to prevent loss. But these are also, it's not really separated from all the small businesses and startups that also need to comply with these regulations. So it really tends to be a burden on the smaller industries that looking to get into finance and accepting card network transactions. So going into kind of the first sections, you're going to have to build and maintain a secure network. You're going to make sure that all of your passwords are changed from their vendor supplied defaults. The next thing is to protect your cardholder data. This is what we call, and in the documentation is the cardholder data environment, or the CDE. You're going to have to make sure that any transmission of this cardholder data is encrypted as it accesses or goes across public networks. The next thing you need to do to be PCI compliant is you need to maintain a vulnerability management program. Any type of newest versions of antivirus and malware software need to be updated and need to be current for the current year of 2020. These systems won't just need to be set up, they also need to be maintained regularly and to make sure they are secure. The next section is on, you need to implement strong access control measures. So restrict access to the CDE only by a need to know basis in your business. So as you look at, having a service that maybe issues credit cards or accepts them, you're going to need to have a business reason for everyone that could potentially touch that piece of data or have access to the CDE. All of these, the access needs to be identified and authenticated. So you will need to look at providers that provide SSO, one long login, Okta, and different types of SSO providers that will need to validate that this user has access to the system under these controls. If you're using a cloud provider, this might not be the biggest issue, but you need to restrict physical access to cardholder data. If you're doing any on-prem work, this will be handled by your on-prem data centers, but you also need to show proof of this. So a lot of these controls are going to be handled by a third-party service in any capacity, but you also have to gather that documentation, and that can really be the time burden we found. Next will be regularly monitoring, testing networks, tracking all the access to network resources, regular testing the security system and processes. And then the last one will be, you need to maintain an InfoSec policy. So information security policy, this will need to be, for a small company that hasn't had one before, this will need to be generated. So you'll need to create that, and then you also need to update it anytime you have any changes to the other 11 sections of the requirements. It needs to be reflected in the information security policy. Well, this gives you a pretty broad understanding of a PCI, but really how granular it really can get and how much individual work's really required on the company if they choose to go through and do this themselves line by line. And keep in mind that even if you get this compliant at one single point in time, every year this will need to be updated and reviewed. Or if there's any major change in your internal systems. So as you're growing, as you're building out new products, as you're pivoting to other products, these are changes that you'll suddenly have to go revisit, even if it was a month after you just did an audit. So which PCI level do you fall into? So here in this visual, you'll see that we'll start with PCI level 4, so under 20,000 transactions per year. Typically, very small e-commerce merchants will be here, as well as small businesses that are doing point-to-point sales. You'll next go to level 3, which is under 1 million transactions per year. The two most common will be, you'll discuss with level 2, from 1 to 6 million transactions per year, or level 1, which is 6 million plus transactions per year. So think of this as for merchants. So we don't have this broken out, but this is for merchants that are accepting any type of payment card. Alternatively, if you're a service provider and deemed a service provider within PCI DSS regulations, and we can follow up and provide more info on that, it's actually broken up into only 2 levels. So level 2, under 300,000 transactions a year, and level 1, over 300,000 transactions. So with that, if you're more in the fintech or financial space and you're deemed a service provider, know that you will you will have to comply with level 2 and then potentially level 1, because Visa, MasterCard, they require a service provider to have much stricter levels of compliance. A very important thing to note is that while this is, the rules on, say, a transaction based of what level you fall into, Visa or the PCI DSS Council can mandate you at any time to be, say, level 2, level 1, even if you don't have the requisite transaction levels. So, know that, be prepared and speak with any partners that you have, or, speak with Visa if you think, they might consider you someone that would need to be PCI level 1. We've seen this typically when they want to do like partnerships and offer a variety of maybe, Visa or MasterCard directed debit or push to card type products, and maybe a suite of fintech products have required them to be level 1, even if they were a brand new startup just starting out. So something good to keep in mind. So here we break down on a calendar year what it would look like to become PCI compliant. Typically, this is going to be for a PCI level 1 provider that we would be getting through a project plan of do it themselves. But this also, a lot of the line items apply to levels 2 through 4 as well. So the first step of finding an auditor, so you're going to need a QSA that will eventually come on site and do your annual PCI audit. From there, they will provide a report and do a gap assessment to identify where your gaps are in your PCI compliance. You'll then have an action item to decide what infrastructure you need to build on top of what you currently have to meet and fill those gaps. The next will be putting in new business controls. So this is all over, the QSA may come on site at the beginning of the year, but then you're going to have a task force and potentially, have a new hire come in and do a lot of the consulting to follow up just for the remediation piece. So beyond just the first month, you're looking at remediation for a few months. So as you put in that new business controls in place, the next is going to be gathering the documentation. So not only are you doing the work, but you also need to have official documentation showing each place where you remediated that gap. Ongoing maintenance, that's going to be where kind of continuous auditing, especially on the access controls, making sure it's on a business need to know basis, that anyone that can touch the cardholder data environment has to be authenticated, and also has to have a sufficient reason to have that access. And then towards the end of the year, you're looking at, revalidating any system modifications. So as you do annual updates, as you roll out new products, these continuously need to be modified. This tends to be where it really gets in a headache of just like continuously, as people pivot, as people offer new products, having to go back through and they almost need to have someone that's a specialist internally, if they are choosing to do it themselves, that can keep these processes in mind and speak with the product manager, speak with engineers to keep them in check with what needs to be PCI compliant. On the opposite side, and while we're discussing this, is VGS and the huge value proposition that we have is being able to do all of this in 7 days. With our solution, we consider it end-to-end PCI compliance, and so really a lot of our customer base and growth is built off of companies see that level of work, see that timeline, see the additional people they need to hire, and they say, hey, we don't want to do this ourselves. So they come to VGS, and then we take on that burden for them. We call it like suffering as a service, so spin off of SaaS. But what we do is we take, we'll find the auditor for you immediately. What we'll do is, try to schedule them as soon as possible. So hopefully that's within 7 days. If it's a busy time around auditing, it might take longer. But what you're looking at with 7 days, there's only 7 days worth of work on your end. And that could be much, much less if it's level 2. We can get you 12 requirements of PCI satisfied, within the first day of integration. If it's a simple data flow or say a week of integration, we can get you PCI level 2. So everything that we just discussed is going to be handled by us. We're going to find the auditor. We're going to do the gap assessment. We're going to be the infrastructure that is your CDE. We're also going to be helping you put in like any new business controls as well as InfoSec policies. So we're going to handle all of that for you, really because we're able to automate that as much as we can through our vaulting system, which I'll explain in a little bit. Before we get too much into VGS, just want to kind of hit on like what happens if you aren't compliant. And like we discussed, this isn't a federal regulation. This isn't a state regulation. This is actually, an internal by the card networks themselves that set up, PCI DSS standards. So this actually has a different, flavor to it, and has a different kind of set of teeth than you would say normal regulation, because they may not, be able to institute the same kind of punishments that a federal regulation might, but it's a really big stifle on being able to actually even do business. So typically, they could issue potential fines if you're out of PCI compliance. If you choose to ignore it, they'll choose to block you from the networks themselves, and then that kind of restricts a lot of your business, right where the funnel is. And then really the thing that they highlight and they stress is that, what they're trying to do is prevent you from having any type of credit card data breach. And that would have a lot of times just huge financial implications, if you do have any data leaked, whether it's, internally someone has access to the wrong system, or externally, let's say that you're storing, credit cards just in an Amazon Web Services S3 bucket. So if they're stored in plain text, that's one of the most common breaches we've seen now. Someone gets access to that, all of your customer data is compromised. So with that, there comes terrible, brand reputation damage, and that can be something that can take a couple of years to recover from. So achieving PCI compliance, you have three options. So you can either build it yourself, you can use kind of disparate solutions. So, individual vendor solutions. Think of this maybe as a payment gateway that offers, allows to capture data on the front end, then only stores it within the processor. Or we have, standalone tokenization solutions that will take your data and batch tokenize it, so allowing you to store a safe token versus the data itself. Or we have an end-to-end PCI solution. So with VGS, we provide a PCI solution that is end-to-end. But if you look at kind of breaking down what's required and the cost, if you did it yourself, you need to, hire new engineers, potentially a new compliance person. You're going to have to build out the data security infrastructure. You'll need to find a QSA that's in your area and then has availability, but they also need to get familiar with the systems. So the audit itself can take a good bit of time. You also need to do all the documentation and of the processes, procedures, and then make sure you can show that documentation at any time. And then all the project planning is handled by you. If you do choose to do a partial solution, to use an outside vendor to handle part of this, in many cases they will be able to say remove you from scope from the partially, maybe where you're holding the cardholder data environment, but the data still comes into your system at some point before it goes into the vault. So you're going to have to really put in these requirements at potentially each step of the place, but only in a smaller scope. So what VGS separates itself is we try to scope you end to end, make sure you never see any type of PAN or CVV or any PCI related data. That way you don't have to worry about any of the 12 requirements. VGS is sometimes compared to a tokenization solution, and we can certainly provide tokenization-like services. But what we do a little bit different is that we completely descope you by using web proxies outside of your system to make sure that that data never touches your system. So without going into intricacies of a proxy, most of the time tokenization solutions are using an API that actually brings your system that's doing the API call in scope. So per PCI regulation, if you're doing API call, the system on one side of it will actually keep you in scope. So you're going to go through all 12 requirements there for that system. What we can do by putting in the proxies around your system is that PCI data exchanges outside of any API call. So you're using your existing data flows, you're using your existing partners, but you're not having anything actually touch or do an API call to handle that. There's a few other benefits here we won't go into in detail, but a lot of it's flexibility with what third parties and also what kind of data formats and data types that you use. So here's a little visual of the proxies themselves, and this is how really VGS is built to match PCI DSS regulations, where because the regulations are really talk a lot about the cardholder data environment, who has access, is it segmented off, what controls do you have in place. We're able to do that at scale with all of our vaults, and so as a PCI level 1 service provider, we're able to have all those controls automatic in place. And so we easily produce the documentation and everything that's needed for the PCI auditor when needed, so that you don't actually have to come up with that documentation yourself or do any InfoSec policies that match that. So very quickly on the front end, this is where you would collect data, whether it's a web application or mobile. Here's the illustration for a proxy. So we're going to redact any PCI related data, set up those filters to remove that from the payload. It's going to be stored in your standalone VGS vault. You're going to receive a safe alias in its place. On the outbound, when you actually need to process that transaction, send it to a third party, we're going to replace the safe alias that you send in the payload with the true value, the true PAN and CVV, and send that on to the third party. Just the same manner as you're currently doing, but now you're completely descoped from PCI. So at no point in your internal systems do you touch PCI data. What we, really why you would do this is to save cost. In the long run, we typically save people 75% versus building it themselves. And one customer example, people always want to know, have you done this before? Certainly. So LendUp is one of the customers we brought on 3 years ago, and they were one of the first people we brought in under a month, PCI level 1, and they launched their card product. The card product changed name to Mission Lane. So now when you see Mission Lane's card product, that's actually powered by VGS. We're able to get them up and launched in PCI level 1 in under 30 days. And so one of the fastest integrations that we've had. And it also was a big, big go-to-market win for them so they can get their product launched. The other benefit of doing PCI compliance in an end-to-end solution is that you really satisfy most requirements for other privacy and security regulations. So if you're looking at SOC 2, GDPR, or CCPA, know that if you set this in place, you're really setting up your foundation to be able to achieve other compliances very easily. Brief selection of customers. We have Brex, which is a credit card issuer. We also have LendUp that I just mentioned, but a variety of, say, travel, marketplaces, also insurance companies. Anyone that really touches payment card data, we can help and we can descope you. So now we're just going to jump into a quick demo. And this is going to be very high level because we just want to show, how we can do this, because we really want to emphasize there's minimal code changes and work needed on your end. So here is what the VGS dashboard looks like. There's a full access sandbox that you can sign up for. So just at verygoodsecurity.com and sign up. And so know that, we have a lot of documentation and a lot of resources available to be self-serve, but we're also here to help you at any point. So when you think about getting started with VGS, it's really 5 steps. You sign up for a free VGS account. You secure your inbound traffic of any PCI data. You secure your outbound traffic to any third parties where you might send PCI related data. You activate your organization, promote your sandbox to live, and then you go live. So 5 steps, we can do this in a day. We can also put together a project plan to do it in a more sequential manner if you need to involve multiple team members. The first part is collecting it in a secure manner. So this is a look at collect.js. This is a JavaScript product we have that you can drop into your front end. We also have an iOS and Android SDK. It's very important for having secure iframes that we self-host that we can sign off on as PCI compliance. This is a big part in showing the QSA and a PCI auditor that these are secure iframes and that this data is collected in a secure manner. Here we go back to the dashboard, and here we're going to set up a quick route. So we'll just start with the inbound to show you what it looks like. So you can generate a fun name or name this, maybe where you're collecting the data. This echo apps at verygood.systems, that's going to be your API server. You can do IP whitelisting. You can also do custom host names. Well, jumping into it, so imagine you have on the front end, you're collecting data securely through collect.js, and then here, this is where you're going to set up the proxy to filter out that PCI data and replace it with an alias. So the goal here is to do that outside of your systems, and what we want to show here is how that works in a very quick manner. So the path, you're going to set up to post, content type, JSON. So this can be any type of content type. You can do a CSV, you can do a PDF, you can do HTML. It's going to be on a request. And then we're going to do card.number, and that's the field that we're going to look like within your transaction flow. It's going to be found in the body, and we're going to do persistent storage. And then here's the important part, is the format. So we're going to do a alias, format preserving alias. So you can choose to do, say, first 6, last 4. So that preserves the bin, the last 4. You can also do a 19-digit fixed length, which we like because it shows a clear, hey, this is an alias. Or, you can do, if you have social security numbers you would also like to collect, we can preserve the last 4 of those as well. So these are all PCI compliant formats. And that is all you need to do to set up a payload that would come through, and we're going to redact a credit card from that. The next thing we would do is set up the same path, set up the same content type on the request, and then what we'll do is account, do CVC, card from the body. Very important to note, you would do volatile storage. So this allows you to, or this requires you to only store this for an hour. Per PCI regulations, you're only going to store a CVC code for an hour. It's going to be a generic alias. And now you save it and you're done. What you've just did is you've completely de-scoped your systems on the inbound from receiving any PCI data. That data will automatically go into a standalone VGS vault for you, and you're going to comply with PCI level 2 regulations. From there, you just do the same thing, but on the opposite side for the outbound, and then you should be good to go. So now we're going to leave a quick time for some questions. So the first question is, what if I use a payment gateway that descopes from PCI compliance? For the most part, that's going to be able to handle partially PCI compliance. You're not going to be able to get that in your own name. You're only really descoping that one payment flow. And I think the other thing that's important to note is that you're suddenly giving all of your payment data and your customer data to a third-party gateway. So as you look at kind of growing, as you look at kind of scaling out your strategy long-term of what you look to build and your infrastructure, most companies will assume that we don't want to be locked into a third-party vendor to handle all of our data, as opposed to something like VGS, where we provide you with a vault, and yes, we're hosting the vault, but it's something you have full control over. Okay, just letting a few more questions come in. Okay, here's a question. The question is, what max added latency do you guarantee in your SLA for the routes? Our most typical latency is 15 milliseconds. We have SLAs in place that can be kind of vary in enterprise plans, varying from 25 to 50 milliseconds at the most. And we can vary that based on your business and what kind of routes you have and what kind of data you're going through. hopefully that answered your question. Happy to follow up with some of these SLA plans afterward. Here's another question. You inherit PCI level 1 from AWS for hosting services / products. That's actually a great question. So AWS, and so we use AWS as well, full disclosure, they will provide, they'll list certain products of their own as PCI compliant, but that does not make you as the customer or the business PCI compliant. So you're not able to get that attestation of compliance in your own name for PCI 2 through 4, and you're not going to have a report on compliance if you need PCI level 1. So that would be a component of where your cardholder data environment is, but you aren't actually PCI compliant yourself. So think of that as the multi-vendor solution, as part of a multi-vendor solution. So with what we do with AWS, we then also put on top of that all of the different controls, and then we have verification for that. You mentioned, next question, you mentioned 21 days for PCI level 1 on the site. That's something that we have done in level 1. We can also do in 7 days. It really depends on the schedule of the auditors. We can do all the work within 7 days. If we can get them scheduled on day 7, then we can get you signed off and get that ROC in your hand by then. It depends on who you want to work with and what qualified QSAs are in your area. Looks like we're a little bit running over time, so we're going to end here. Feel free to follow up. I'm going to follow up and make sure I can answer every question. I can just contact me at jody@verygoodsecurity.com or sales@verygoodsecurity.com. Thanks for joining us this morning. I hope this was helpful, and please contact us at any point to learn more about PCI. Thanks, everyone.